Hello, social studies teachers or future social studies teachers. Right now we're going to look at something called the C3 framework. C3, college, career, and civic. College, career, and civic, and that's where we get the term C3. You need to know what the C3 framework is and why it is now the framework for all social studies and where this really came about. The C3 framework started and was created after this thing called Common Core. So what's Common Core? So I'm going to show you a quick video on what Common Core is.
Like it or not, life is full of measuring sticks. How smart we are, how fast we are, how well we can, compete. But up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. We like to think that our education system does that. But when it comes to learning what they really need to be successful after graduation, is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. That's making it too hard to know if our kids are really doing well enough overall, and if they can really compete for a job someday. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. They're like a total sea change in education. Consistent, strong, clear benchmarks for English language arts and math. Here's how it works. You can think of kindergarten through 12th grade like a giant staircase. Each step is a skill your child needs to learn before stepping up to the next one. But right now, too many kids aren't really confident with like 2 plus 2 before they have to move on to 2 times 2. We need more focus on the skills that help them move up the stairs, or they can slip up and fall behind. And there's another problem. What if everyone's stairs were made at different heights? Well, here we go again. They are. So, a boy in Seattle who's rocking an A in English literature could be getting a C on his Chicago friend's staircase. Oops. We need to create consistent steps in education, too. So first, each standard creates a landing on the staircase, a stop along the way as your child heads toward high school graduation. Each stop is a chance for every parent and teacher to focus on the skills their students are supposed to know at that step, no matter the zip code, language, or race. And more importantly, each standard makes sure all students are learning what they need to know to get to graduation and beyond. Because something like counting to 100 leads to understanding dollars and cents, which eventually leads to understanding how to manage a budget. Secondly, the standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase. But standards aren't learning. That's why we need teachers, parents, and students to help make that happen by working together to help kids meet these standards. The world's getting more and more competitive every day. But now, when our kids get to the top of their staircase, they can have way more options on where their life goes from there. Clear goals, confident, well-prepared students. That's the Common Core state standards.
So we now see what Common Core is and where it came from. It really also came from this idea of federal money. So George W. Bush and President Obama at the time start discussing how we can really push this national curriculum towards being adopted by all the states. And one thing to do that, and one way to do that, is to encourage a Common Core by giving grants. So one grant was called Race to the Top, which was a major hundreds of millions of dollars worth of grant that was given to states who had adopted Common Core. So now you see where Common Core is. And if you talk to anyone, they pretty much say that Common Core on paper isn't really a bad idea. Now there's YouTube videos that show parents slamming Common Core and destroying it and saying it's difficult or it's hard. But one thing that we see with social studies, because that's what we want to focus on, is social studies was left out of the Common Core except for a small little section. And what I'm looking at right now is the Common Core for English Language Arts, which came out. By 2010, 2011, this was ready and this was out. And as you scroll through the Common Core for English, you see right here under this section, you'll see it says Standards for English Language, and then Standards for Literacy and History, Social Studies, Science, and Technical Subjects. So on page 61, it has reading standards for social studies. So let's just jump to page 61. And you can see that it says right here, the standards below begin at grade 6, standards for K through 5 reading, science and technical, the CCR, the Common Core Readiness, anchor standards and high. So great, and it really just gives you this one page of if someone's a really good social studies student, what they should be able to do with Common Core. So the Common Core really is just one page in the English literacy Common Core. So I say that because you see the problem. Social studies is not being pushed as a major. We need Common Core standards for social studies, nor is science. I mean, math and English were the ones that they had produced. So social studies wasn't really asked if they wanted to make Common Core. And they kind of covered it in this one little page here. And you're like, man, that's not much at all. And I don't really know if that's enough for our entire subject. So, in 2010, the state superintendents, the consortium of state superintendents, said that we really need to push towards a Common Core framework for social studies, a new framework. And it took 3 years. It was really pushed by a lot of private grants, private institutes. And in 2013, they decided to release what was known as the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards, State Guidance for Enhancing the Rigor of K through 12 Civics, Economics, Geography, and History. The C3 framework was developed to serve two audiences: for the states to upgrade their state social studies standards, and for the teachers, the local school districts, the schools, the teachers, and the curriculum writers to strengthen their social studies programs. So the objectives of the C3 model for social studies was to enhance the rigor of social studies discipline and to build critical thinking, problem solving, and necessary skills to prepare someone to become a citizen, but also to align the academic programs in social studies in the Common Core state standards for English language. So it was really to expand off English and make everything aligned. So that's one thing that we kind of we forget about, is the C3 model was also supposed to align with the Common Core that was created. So there might be one of the weaknesses, is the committee from 2010 to 2013 was told you have to create a C3 model that was going to align with the English Common Core. So they were kind of handcuffed on that. So I'm going to pull that. This is the Common Core model. So let me just, I'm going to open up the social studies, and here that is. It actually says a guidance for enhancing the rigor of K through 12 civics. What are the guiding principles of this document? Well, it's driven by that social studies prepares the nation's young people for college, career, and civic life. So college, career, and civic life. That inquiry, the ability to inquire about concepts, is at the heart of all social studies. That social studies involves interdisciplinary applications and welcomes integration of the arts and the humanities. Social studies is composed of deep and enduring understandings, concepts, and skills, and that social studies emphasizes skills and practices as preparation for democratic decision making. And that you should have direct and explicit learning outcomes just like Common Core. So the connection, one thing you'll notice as you look at this document, and that's the one glaring thing that they don't mention, is that they don't really tell you about the content. You know, they don't say, well, in U.S. history, you would teach this area like that. So they kind of leave the content out. And they talk about this idea of what's called the inquiry arc. So always talking about the inquiry arc. So let's go ahead and look at the inquiry arc. It is on page 12. The inquiry arc highlights the structure of and the rationale for the organization of the framework's 4 dimensions. The arc focuses on the nature of inquiry in general and the pursuit of knowledge through questions in particular. So you have dimension 1, dimension 2, developing questions, applying tools and concepts, evaluating, and communicating conclusions. So there's your arc right there. Now you say, well, what about the National Social Studies Standards? The C3 framework was purposely designed to offer guidance for state social studies standards, not to outline specific content to be delivered. For states utilizing the C3 framework, the 10 themes of the 2010 NCSS National Standards will be useful. But the 4 dimensions of the inquiry are in the C3 framework correspond with all things that are National Council for Social Studies. The questions for exploration, the knowledge, the process, the product. The question, the knowledge, the processes, and the product. So what we want to know is what will learners need to understand, what will learners be capable of doing, and how will learners demonstrate understanding. So why do we need this massive document that has now been created? Well, let me go ahead and show you a video that's very technical talking about the C3 model.
Hi, my name's Sarah Brandt, and today we're going to be talking about where to begin when mapping a middle school social studies course using the C3 framework for social studies. And we're going to be using my 8th grade history course as an example. There are a lot of moving parts when we start to think about mapping with the C3 framework. And as social studies teachers, we are probably already using standards and possibly a textbook, in addition to trying to keep up with current events in the world and in the community. It can be difficult to know exactly where to begin. Before I start mapping with the C3 framework, it's very important that I understand the overall purpose and structure of the framework. The inquiry arc is the process of learning that the C3 intends to take teachers and students through. It aims to approach studying social studies from the perspective of a historian or a social scientist, beginning with a question before jumping into content and research, and ultimately creating deliverables to show what you have learned. There are 4 dimensions in the C3 that walk you through creating this process for your students. Dimension 1 has you create compelling questions. These are the questions that will drive the course of study in your unit. Dimension 2 provides the content aspect of the inquiry arc and focuses on disciplinary concepts. Dimension 3 is concerned with the methods and skills your students will use to research the content in order to answer that unit's compelling question. And Dimension 4 is the actionable items that students will display to show what they have learned in the unit as it is relevant today. Once I have a handle on the structure of the C3 framework, I can begin to think about mapping my course. I'll need to make sure I am prepared with my materials. In my case, that includes my state's social studies standards for grade 8 and the C3 framework for social studies for grades 6 through 8. I have printed out a copy of each of these and brought a pencil and highlighter so that I can make notes as I analyze each of them. Before I begin, it's also important for me to think about how my materials will work together to form units. Since I will be using the C3 in conjunction with the state standards that I am already required to align with, it made most sense to me to begin with the standards. So in my first step, I will read meticulously through the standards, jotting notes as I go through to help me start grouping them into buckets. For step 2, after reading through and grouping the standards on paper, I will group them directly in Atlas by drafting unit topics and aligning with the standards. In step 3, I'm going to start forming compelling questions to match my buckets of standards. I'm also going to go ahead and rename my units to more accurately reflect what the unit is truly aimed at. I'm going to try to keep it to one compelling question for each unit. Since the compelling question is the main point that my students are expected to explore and come back to throughout the unit, I want to make sure it is focused enough so that they don't get overwhelmed. If I have more than one strong, compelling question within a unit, I may want to think about breaking that information into more than one unit. In step 4, I'm going to take an initial pass at aligning to the remaining C3 dimensions. At this point, I'm starting to think about what resources my students may use to explore the content they'll need to know as they grapple with each unit's compelling question, as well as the type of skills they'll need to use those resources. And finally, I'm thinking about how my students will display the knowledge they have gained with actionable items, such as a journal or a petition. At this point, I don't want to lay out all of the details of my unit, but I do want to think about what I might be able to cover in my unit as I go through and align with dimensions 2 through 4 of the C3 framework. Once I have aligned with the C3, I'll need to make sure there aren't any gaps. So in step 5, I'll meet with my team and make sure that everything is covered. Since the C3 is grade banded, it's not expected that I will hit every single item in my course, but I will want to go through and make sure my colleagues have covered the portions that I skipped over. The standards analysis report in Atlas can help accomplish this if I run a report that looks specifically at which C3 standards in my grade band have not yet been covered. Now my team can go through and add the missing standards to units where they make sense. After running through these 5 steps, I have formed my units, and within each unit, I have aligned with the standards, aligned with the C3, and formed compelling questions. This is a really great starting point from which I can build out the rest of the information in my units. Something to keep in mind as you are planning your units is that while the ultimate goal is to go through the full inquiry arc in each unit, it's okay to start the school year by introducing pieces of it to help get your students familiar and comfortable with the process of thinking like a historian before introducing the full inquiry arc in one unit. For example, I may choose to focus on content and research skills, dimensions 2 and 3, in my first unit, and developing actionable items from the compelling question, dimensions 1 and 4, in my second unit, before diving into the whole process in my third unit. But that's just one example. Mapping, especially with a new standards framework like the C3, can seem daunting when you first begin. Just remember that the ideas of the C3 framework aren't brand new. Driving instruction with questions, emphasizing research methods, and applying findings in a relevant present-day format are practices that we as social studies teachers are constantly incorporating in our classrooms. The C3 is simply a way to structure and emphasize those practices so we can become more purposeful with how we introduce those skills to our students. And remember, the Rubicon team is always here to support you.
So you might ask at this point, why do we need this? Why do we need this C3 framework? Well, first off, you saw the biggest need, and that was a marginalization of social studies. That the English Common Core standards that were released before 2010 actually say, they only put us on a couple of pages, and they kind of just say that social studies isn't that important. And with the high stakes testing that's going on, and also this mindset that anyone can be a social studies teacher. You know, most social studies teachers are coaches, and anyone can do that. I watch the History Channel, so I'm good at social studies. We've got to step back and say, no, we're not doing this. You know, this isn't fair. And we actually have a very good program. Yes, we're also coaches, but we also do a really good job on teaching and having elements such as that. Also, it motivates students. By understanding how students can learn and trying to make students learn by complex and this multifaceted world that they inhabit, they'll actually become engaged in the instruction and actually flourish. And also, it's the future of our democracy. My abundant research bears out that the sad reality that fewer and fewer young people, particularly students of minority students of poverty, students receiving high quality social studies education, despite the central role of social studies in preparing students for their responsibilities. that the research shows that they're not really receiving great education, and that we can give them great education if we bring in these elements such as this. And it talks about collaboration is the key. So let's just look at a couple of elements right here of the Common Core. So let's just look at, and what is this document showing us? Well, first off, we have our introduction here, the C3 Framework Leadership Team, who wrote it, all that. We don't have to look at that. How to read the document. It's going to show you what all this means and dimension subsections. But look at this. The nature arc of the C3 framework. Dimension 1, developing questions and planning inquiries. So some of y'all may be working on your unit plans at this time. So if we just jump down to page 23. Questions and the desire to answer them give life to inquiry and thus to the C3 framework. So central to a rich social studies experience is the capability for developing questions that can frame and advance an inquiry. Consider example. So let's scroll down right here. By the end of grade 2, individually and with others, students construct and compelling questions and explain why the compelling question is important to the student. Identify disciplinary ideas associated with the compelling question. By the end of grade 5, they explain why compelling questions are important to others. And by grade 12, they explain how a question reflects an enduring issue in the field. They explain points of agreement and disagreement experts have about interpretations and applications of dictionary concepts. So, what does this mean? That's just a little bitty thing. When you're planning your lesson plans and you're planning your procedures, when you start talking about questions, you want to look at the C3 model and make sure that, okay, I'm teaching a 9th grade class. I need to make sure that these students already are able to address these. They can explain how a question represents key ideas in the field. And when I ask that question on my procedures, I want to put parentheses, C3, and you could say dimension 1, 1.1, 6 through 8, something like that. And by the way, this is dimension 1, 3, grades 6 through 8. Just like this is dimension 1, section 1, 6 through 8, 1, 2, and 1, 3. As it goes, individuals with other students construct supporting questions, determining helpful sources. And so this gives you an idea. So let's scroll back up to our table. Let's look at gathering, dimension 3, gathering and evaluating sources. Page 54. So students, this is dimension 3. This is line 1, grades 6 through 8. When individuals with other students gather relevant information from multiple sources while using the origin, authority, structure, context, and corroborative value of the sources. By a 12th grade student, they should gather relevant information from multiple sources, representing a wide range of views, while using the origin, the authority, the structure, context to value the sources to guide this selection. Line 2, evaluate the credibility of a source by examining how experts value the source. That's a very good point. So we've gone from one page listed in the English Common Core to actually multiple levels on showing us as teachers what we should be expecting from our students at each grade level or each range of grade level, 5th and 8th grade, and elements such as that. Let's look at history, causation, and augmentation. Let's go to 45, history. Individual with other students, look at 12th grade. Evaluate how historical events and developments were shaped by unique circumstances of time and place, as well as broader and historical context. Analyze change and continuity in historical eras. Just perspectives, it talks about that. So the C3 model is a great model, which will show you as a teacher what you should be thinking and how your students should be cognitively developed when they get to certain grade areas. So the C3 model does not teach us what we need to teach. It doesn't say, that's what the state standards are for. The C3 model teaches us what we should be expecting mentally from our students and where they should be on their arc, on their learning arc. So what I would like for you to do is think about homework. And when we look at homework, I want you to create a lesson plan. Okay? This can be one of your 10-day lesson plans. But in your procedures, on one of your 10-day lesson plans, I want you to go ahead and start labeling some C3 indicators. So, for example, during one of your 10-day unit plans, we want to start seeing this pop up. If you ask somebody a question, then if you have an activity, see if you can link it to one of these. Now, we should all pretty much be 6 through 8 or 9 through 12. So you need to go ahead and in parentheses put D2, history, something like that, and those elements such as that. So all I want you to do is start in your 10-day lesson plans, start peppering some C3 indicators. So for a real world example, if I have my students looking at the Zapruder film, and that's going well, then I want them to look at the sources and analyze the sources and see what's going on with that. So that would probably be one of these under these source indicators, and we want to indicate that. All right. So that's what the C3 model is, and you're going to hear a lot of that. And sometimes we just sit there and go, "Oh, what is that? That's just something else." Well, the NCSS has their 10 themes. Each state has their state standards. We do not have Common Core. We have C3, which kind of connects to the Common Core, but also gives us a way to understand how our students are thinking. So look at the C3 model. I'm going to attach it to this email and let you be able to read it as well. I'm going to put it on the YouTube video. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for listening.
Social studies has been here a long time. And as a teacher, we know you have lots of great memories of it in the classroom. It's come a long way, from when you had to loosen the belt to hold more books, when every lesson left a mark and added a new accessory to your outfit, when history was hand-drawn, when every decade was a little different, and the idea remained even when the class was over, when you had the world on a string and it turned at your pace, when a deck of cards could reveal all of the answers, when number 2 was the number 1 choice for more than one thing. History had its own mixtape, and launching audio was harder than a mouse click. And finding a song was as hard as finding the new world. And when going wireless took a lot of D batteries. When the latest video didn't quite fit in the palm of your hand. When data was a bit floppier. When memory was measured in K, not G. And when the word network had a very different meaning. With all these tools over the years, you were able to shed some light on the subject of social studies. And Pearson made the trip with you. You've changed with the social studies classroom. So have we.